let's keep this very simple, okay? So when you look at what a healthy disciple is and what they do, we want to follow the model of Jesus. Obviously, we want to follow his example. So what should a disciple be all about? And Jesus had a great balance of his relationships. And in just a moment, we're going to walk through a visual tool from Mike Breen in 3DM Ministries that helps to simply illustrate how Jesus balanced his relationships. But first, let's boil this down for just the sake of simplicity. Matthew 22, verses 35 through 40, Jesus was asked a very simple question, but I mean, it was could have been a very tough question for anybody else, but for Jesus, it was, what is the greatest commandment in the law? One of the Pharisees was trying to trip him up, and of course, Jesus said two things. He boiled it down to two things. He basically took all of the Old Testament and put it into two phrases. He said, number one, love God with everything that you are, everything that you have. So love God with all of your heart, soul, and mind. And the second is like it. He said to love others. Love your neighbor just like you love yourself. And so he put all of that together. He put the whole Old Testament and the entire law into these two things. So that simplifies that for me and you, right? That as far as our relationships and what we should be all about, we should be primarily all about loving God. Not just with one aspect of our life, but with everything. We know that. And the second one, we should love our neighbors like we love ourselves. So something to help us to understand a little bit more about that is, if you look at your neighbor the way you look at yourself, to what extent do you go to help yourself? When you're hungry, what you going to do? You're going to feed yourself. You're going to take care of yourself, no matter what the cost, right? Well, that's how we're supposed to love our neighbors. So love God, love our neighbors, and then the other major truth that we've already discussed a little bit is the Great Commission from Matthew 28. So Jesus said, go make disciples. So if you take these two passages from the New Testament, from Matthew's account, then you have these three basics. Love God, all right? I feel like we're going back to like third grade Sunday school here. If we were doing that, we need some flannel graph. I don't have any flannel graph, I'm fresh out. Love God, love others, or love people, and through this, we then make disciples, right? Now, the reason I wanted to put this in front of us is because this is simple. If you can boil everything down to these three basic truths, then it should affect everything that we do. So every healthy disciple should be about these three things: loving God, loving others, and making disciples. So Mike Breen draws it out like this to illustrate the truth that Jesus lived out in Luke chapter 6. Let me put it over here. Luke chapter 6, you see where Jesus is about to call his disciples. And what did he do before he called the disciples? Like the night before, what he did was he went and he got alone with the Father. He had a habit of doing this, right? Where he would get alone with God to focus his heart, focus his mind, and to be with his dad. So he did that before a major decision, such as calling the disciples. And as you progress in Luke chapter 6, you see that then he calls the disciples, and then right after that, he then goes, meets with a large crowd, and begins to heal the sick, cast out demons. And so through Jesus' example, this one simple passage in Luke chapter 6, we want to draw this out. Three relationships that we just talked about are very important. And Jesus had the perfect balance in these relationships. So you have love God. This is where we're going to draw it out. Love God, love people, love others. and make disciples. Okay, so let's draw this out. Our relationship should be balanced in such a way that we first spend time in this up relationship. The up relationship is time with God, right? So this is time with God the Father. This would be John 15:5. John 15:5, Jesus says that He is the vine and we're the branches. And if we remain in Him and His Word remains in us, and we know what's going to happen, we're going to bear fruit, right? But what happens when we sever this relationship? It's just like if you were to take a grapevine, or we're in Alabama, so let's muscadine, or from Jasper. I'm from Jasper, so I'm going to say muscadine, right? So if you take a muscadine vine and cut it off, you've removed its source. And so eventually that vine is going to die, right? So that's what Jesus says happens here. Our relationship with God, the Father, is the most critical relationship that we have. He is our source. And this is something that we can't take for granted, but we should be so dialed in with the Father in this up relationship that when there's something wrong with that relationship, it affects everything. And so our time with the Father should be, let's go back to that definition we shared a while ago. Our time with the Father should be intentional. And we should vary it. We should change it up a little bit. Don't just sit in the same place, in the same posture every single day. But spending time with the Lord, sometimes when you come across something like Psalm 29, where you're to ascribe glory to the name of God, if you can sit there and truly do that, that's fine. But sometimes you need to get on your face. You need to get on the floor. Get on your knees if you're physically able. Making sure that the time with the Father is intentional. Next is the in relationships. Okay, so you have the up relationships. You have the in relationships, which is time with other believers. So it's time with the Father, time with other believers. This would be 2 Timothy 2:2, as illustrated from Paul telling Timothy, who is his true son in the faith, is what Paul called him. He said in 2 Timothy 2:2, what I want you to do, Timothy, is take everything that I've taught you, and I want you to find some reliable men and entrust those teachings to them, so that then they would take it and teach other people. And so this is intentional time with other Christians. And let me just say this. I'm not talking about Sunday school. This is not talking about corporate worship. This is in our relationships, personal relationships. So here, this section here, in our intentional relationships with other believers, I'm talking about an accountability relationship where people are free to ask you questions and you're free to ask them questions. One of the questions I like to ask people is when evaluating, do you have these type of relationships in your life where they have the freedom to hold you accountable? Who is it in your life who's not blood related, but they have the freedom to come into your house and they can go through your fridge anytime? Not because they're looking for anything bad, but because they're looking for something good, because they're going to eat your food or whatever. Who has that kind of freedom in your life that they can just come in and feel totally at home in your house, right? Because these are the people that we need to cultivate a relationship with. So, time with the Father, time with other believers, and then the out relationships would be time on mission. And again, Matthew 28:18 through 20. You picking up on a theme here for everything we do? Matthew 28. In this passage here, this is talking about that as you live your life, you are on mission. Understand that when Jesus stood there, physically stood in front of the disciples, and He said, all authority in heaven and on earth belong to me. He wasn't kidding. He was back from the dead. And so He said, because I have all authority in heaven and on earth, you can't go anywhere on earth that Jesus doesn't own and that he doesn't have authority there. You can't go anywhere in the heavens. If you went to Mars, you'll probably see an Alexander Shannara billboard, but you're going to see that Jesus owns it. Jesus is there. Jesus has all authority and power everywhere in the heavens as well. And then he says this, therefore, go make disciples. He didn't send the disciples out on a mission trip. He released them to live missional lives. Because he said, as you're living your life, it's not a short-term mission trip. It's not where you go somewhere, do something for God, and then you come home from that. We never come home from the Great Commission. As his ambassador, as his representative, we are constantly representing him. Whether we are at Taco Bell or whether we're in Russia serving the Lord. Doesn't matter, wherever we are. We're always constantly aware of what God has called us to do. So, a healthy disciple should keep these three relationships in balance. That they're spending time with the Father, they're spending intentional time with other believers, and they are aware of the lost world around them. And they're trying to reach those people and share Christ wherever they are. Home, work, play, school, whatever. And so one way to kind of diagnose how are you doing in these relationships, if you put a 0 in the middle of the triangle and created a scale of 0 to 10 going to each of the points, 10 being the best, the challenge here is that you would rate yourself. How are you doing? 0 to 10 in your relationship with God. 10 being the closest. Put a mark. Wherever you feel like you are right now. Same thing. How are you doing in your mentoring, discipling relationships with other believers? 0 to 10. 10 being the best. Put a mark. Same thing here. On mission. How are you doing on mission? So if this was my diagnosis here, you connect the dots to create another triangle. And then you can see where you have more room to grow, right? You see this. Jesus would have pinged at a 10 on each of these levels. And that should be what we strive for. That's what a healthy disciple should strive for. To love God, to love others, to make disciples. And y'all, I'm convinced that this relationship here is one that we struggle with probably the most. We've had this one hounded so much, and a lot of people understand this. We even have a lot of understanding of this one. I'm not saying we don't have room to grow in these, but I'm saying this one here is probably where a lot of us need some help. Because again, you don't find that in a program. You find that in relationships. And we're going to focus on that in a few sessions ahead of us here. But next, in our next session, we're going to look at taking this healthy disciple and what kind of culture do you grow disciples in. So in the next session, it's going to be all about a healthy disciple-making culture.